Dear all, welcome to the 17th lecture in the New Directions in Eileen Chen Studies. Eileen Chen Studies Lecture Series. In Chinese is 张爱玲研究新方向讲座系列. My name is Alvin Wong, Assistant Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and also the moderator for today's events. First, I wish to thank my colleagues, Professor Nicole Kwan in Comparative and also Professor Lin Peiying in the School of Chinese for initiating the series and providing a much needed platform for showcasing new research on Eileen Chen, world literature and comparative literature. The lecture by Professor Sijia is co-sponsored by the School of Chinese, School of Humanities, and also Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures, and the Department of Comparative Literature. Now let me introduce our speaker today. Sijia Yao received her PhD in Purdue University, and she is an assistant professor of Chinese language and culture at Soka, University of America. She has published articles on Sinophone literature, film, music, and culture in journals such as the Comparative Literature Studies, and these are all really the top journals in the field. Tompkins Review and Telos, and her book Cosmopolitan Love, Utopian Vision in D.H. Lawrence and Eileen Chen was published by University of Michigan Press in November 2023, and I believe it's also public access, right? It's open access.
Yes.
So you can also you can buy it, but also you can also get access at the University of Michigan website. Her lecture today is entitled "Affective Cosmopolitanism: Comparison, Methodology, and a Case Study." So please join me in welcoming Professor Yao to HKU.
Thank you so much for Alvin. Your very nice and generous introduction to me. I don't know, I'm so good. It's such a great pleasure to be here in University of Hong Kong, a school that Eileen Chen once attended. I always want to be here. And I just, thank you, my book. So I just want to take this chance to also thank the School of Chinese and Comparative Literature Department, the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures. Thanks for your generous sponsoring for this event. And also I want to send special particular thanks to Alvin, Professor Alvin Wong, Nicole Huang, and also Professor Lin Peiying for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here and meet all of you. So today's topic is affective cosmopolitanism, comparative methodology, and a case study. So I'm gonna first give you an outline of the talk. So you can see that Alvin already introduced the book. So my talk is going to be focusing on the first part of introduction, which is the theoretical framework of the methodology part to do the comparative work between D.H. Lawrence and Eileen Chen, which is called the third term comparative methodology I'm proposing in this book. And then I'm going to give you a case study which is based on the chapter 2, which is about sexual love between D.H. Lawrence and Eileen Chen, to give you a more crystallized idea of this third term comparative methodology. Love as a feeling is universal. Since we all have a sense for what it means, this default understanding of love is as deeply rooted and unconsciously ingrained in us as our relationship to our own family. Consequently, we are too familiar with it to be able to step back and really observe its form and significance. To really see what love is would require us to step outside of ourselves as if we had been born in a different time and place. It is only through approaching love in a drastically different cultural system that we are able to truly see the real picture of love in our own mind as well as the others. To understand love requires a comparison, and to understand ideas of Chinese love and Western love, we need to step out of the confines of each tradition to compare how the concept of love emerged and developed in distinct ways in each context. Such a comparison brings up methodological issues of the validity and comparative methods between texts from disparate cultures. When a text from one cultural tradition is taken up in another one, biases are inseparable because they are the symptoms of the process by which any text is received in terms of the receiver's preconceptions. And previous scholars has focused on uncovering the distortion and misunderstandings that such biases engender. Yet, these biases do not have to constitute a barrier to comparison, which depends upon the mediation that is essential to all cultural reception. Ponsossi claims, quote, mediation becomes visible as preconception or bias. And Saucy also emphasized, quote, that we are always in the midst of mediation, that mediation is our authenticity, whoever we may be, end quote. But if mediation is necessary, we do not have to treat the process of mediation as a liability or a source of distortion. Rather, we can take control of the mediation process by consciously choosing a bias, which is to say, a particular intention to guide the analysis. This conscious intention defines the third term that motivates the comparison and offers it a direction. When it comes to the methodology of comparison, the question that needs to be addressed first is the purpose of comparison, which must be established before the task of, in Shishume's words, quote, activating and activating the historically specific set of relationality across time and space, end quote. The inherent intention of comparing determines what I call the third term comparison method, which establishes at the outset a purpose that enables the concentration on two texts from two very distinctive cultural contexts, re-establishing and reshaping relationships. The third term allows us to investigate a text in its relationship to its own tradition, and then to compare those two relationships to each other. Comparative methodology offers a redemption when it can de-binarize the comparative subjects as well as de-integrate comparison from fixed notions and stale norms. Dismantling this rigid binary tendency in comparison, third-term comparison as a heuristic tool can oppose antagonizing comparative objects by defining a common purpose, which can then provide the basis for revealing disparate connections, yet also subtle differences in the relational comparative mode. In this way, the relation between China and the West as the two major comparative subjects would no longer have to be framed as opposing binaries, nor as competing hegemonies, but can be seen as relational and conversational. It is always problematic to set up a comparison in such a way that it will essentialize China or the West within a binary model that attempts to define China or the West as a fixed opposition. After all, such a fixed definition would lead to a hardening of opposing political stances and inclinations. With a new level of tension between China and the West, it is more urgent to return to the origin of comparison and ponder upon the bigger picture of a common purpose. This purpose is not an international agreement that is reached through discussions and negotiations, not an international cooperative project to achieve global economic development, not transnational work to save the poor or stop war, not an environmental agreement to solve the urgent problems of global warming and resource depletion. Although these concrete and significant cosmopolitan projects alleviate national and regional conflicts through cooperation and shared interests, their temporary shared goals must still contend with the deeper divisions and tensions that can eventually stymie cooperation. A more foundational and necessary purpose, therefore, is called upon to set an enabling condition for relationality and dialogue. Without attempting to solve the social political problems, it critiques the dominant social political orders through the personal and private. This purpose can trigger a new perspective to approach the two comparative entities in order to know the entities themselves. The two comparative objects, China and the West, in this sense, are beyond the traditional notions of themselves. They could be reduced to the very basic unit of free body or will, an author who is deeply embedded in his or her own local culture, but also transgressing boundaries with the purpose of remeasuring and redefining the world. This way, the notions of China and the West are emancipated from a geopolitical structure to become fluid, dynamic, and transforming. They stop defining each other through opposition, but instead open up to overlapping and echoing tendencies. Such an approach can provide the conceptual tool to establish a China-West purposive comparative paradigm that can explore both the connections and the disparities between China and the West. Eschewing a symmetrical comparison, or the comparative mode that emphasizes one-sided or mutual influences. The third-term comparison method moves beyond binary comparison in order to draw attention to the third element, the purposive basis of comparison, to create the framework for illuminating the disparate connection. Comparison of modern love is particularly appropriate for modern texts because of increasing relations between cultures. A comparison of the work of D.H. Lawrence and Eileen Chen de-binarizes China and the West with cosmopolitan love as the purposive basis, tailoring a China-West parallel comparison mode to an analogical mode that can explore the heterogeneous connections between East and West. Consequently, the third-term comparative mode is the key to discovering the common project of cosmopolitan love in Lawrence and Chen, who practiced a new concept of cosmopolitanism as poetic selves as well as real selves. The comparison can help Western readers to understand Chen and help Chinese readers to comprehend Lawrence, thus serving as an effective intercultural means to better understand these two important national writers and the cultures that they represent. Moreover, the comparison by revealing an alternative trajectory allows Western readers to better understand the significance of Lawrence's work and helps Chinese readers to gain insight into Chan's work. In this comparative project, Cosmopolitan Love serves not simply as a persistent literary theme of universal importance, but a nexus of links between things that were previously thought to be separate. Furthermore, charged with rich ideological and cultural energy, the idea of cosmopolitan love forms an alternative logic or rhetoric of modernism. It can expand from the private sphere into the public as an existential and social political quest that motivates the individuals to reimagine local particularities and a unitary global idiom. Yet the methodological focus on connections and similar love forms does not downplay the complex and underlying differences of each writer's response towards their local cultures, as well as their idiosyncratic literary aesthetics. The equally important insight readers can gain from the comparison stems from the rich details of the unique artistic forms encoded with different social, political, cultural, aesthetic, and metaphysical meanings. Lawrence and Chan, equally courageous truth tellers, share Nietzsche's countercultural orientation against most of their contemporaries and offer us alternative modes of thinking about love, the interrelation between family and society, and overall, the meaning of our existence in a dramatically changing world. As a result, the point of the comparison is not simply to compare two concepts of love in different cultures or historical periods. Rather, the comparison carries two sets of relationships: the disparate connections between the two authors and the respective authorial responses towards their own times. The relationship to the other author illuminates each other's specific choices and their consequences in their specific cultural contexts. Without the comparison, the rebellion is a necessary action rather than a particular choice. By comparing an author's choices with those of another author in a comparable context, we can see the differences between local contexts within the same problem area, as well as better understand authorial attempts to address the problem. Each author's rebellion becomes one possibility within a field of alternatives. Therefore, the comparison makes it possible to invoke the alternative trajectory of realities in each context. By comparing the tension between Chen and her historical time with the tension between Lawrence and his time, the comparison illuminates the two historical times as much as each author illuminates the other. The historical limitations Chen faces become more intelligible when compared with the different limitations Lawrence is confronted with, and vice versa. These differences in limitations lead to different strategies in the two authors' works, though both attempt to focus on the personal aspect as the driver of a revised attitude toward social, economic, and political structures. Each author pursues a distinctive approach to this project, and the comparison highlights the choices made by each author. Comparison always needs to involve writers who are in opposition to their times. Such opposition to the times is not always a characteristic of great writers, but more importantly creates the possibility of comparison for some purpose. Such tension is what needs to be compared. In contrast, a comparison between Jane Austen and Lin Shuhua is plausibly workable, and yet not sufficiently revealing because love and marriage represented by both writers complied with and bolstered the social orders of their times. A comparison without attention merely generates a one-dimensional view, even though the common theme of love is salient and comparable. Lawrence's and Chan's proposed solutions to their times may have differed if they ever proposed any concrete solutions, yet their reactions towards their times are common. An adamant attitude of critique towards their times through the focus on a cosmopolitan love that investigates personal relationships in a way that leads to a critique of existing structures. It is the tension between the author and the historical time that allows the personal love to intervene in the social political problems and tightly connect to two seemingly distinctive authors and their cultures. The point of the comparison is not merely to find commonalities, but to compare the ways in which a common purpose produces different conflicts in the two contexts. This project is an attempt to discover not only the links between the two writers, but more importantly, the disparate connections the two writers formulated between East and West. Lawrence's and Chan's intellectual and literary methods to approach the world echo with a comparative methodology based on intention. An unyielding refusal to be integrated socially and politically in order to transcend the hegemonic constraints of the local. This purpose of critiquing is not only practiced in their writing, but also their way of living in real life. Motivated by a cosmopolitan logic, they both cross national borders to further their engagement with the world. Writing as migrants, both writers were motivated by cosmopolitan visions to test the mutability of Englishness or Chineseness in their own writings. The comparison between Lawrence and Chan breaks down the binary between China and the West by focusing on how their common purposes provides the conceptual tool for analyzing relationships between different cultures, which are themselves changing. The third term comparative mode begins with the definition of a purposive basis of comparison, in this case, cosmopolitan love, which allows us to see how a particular vision of love develops in different ways in China and the West. Rather than focusing on fixed concepts, the analysis takes their common purpose as a way to understand the complicated processes of conceptual change and transformation in each culture. Therefore, this analysis can highlight the similarities and differences between the two traditions in a way that can lead to the development of a rich intercultural mediation as a basis for new relationships, which might replace rivalry or universality in a time of conflict and cultural imperialism. The two writers' cosmopolitan practices hold particular value for today's increasingly insulated and chauvinistic political climates in China, the United States, England, and Europe. So now I've finished the third term comparative methodology part, and I'm going to move on to this case study to compare Lawrence's The Virgin and the Gypsy and Eileen Chan's Last Caution. Lawrence's The Virgin and the Gypsy concentrates on a woman's discovery of her sexual desire and primal selfhood. Yvette, a bourgeois young woman, is stifled by her rectory family's false morality and the corrupt social order around them. At the climax of the narrative, she is transfigured by a flood. In his analysis of the novel, F.R. Leavis connects the flood with the change in Yvette when he points out, quote, the crucial significance of desire, of vindicating desire in the sense of compelling a clear and clean and reverent recognition, end quote. The flood mythically represents Yvette's female desire, a desire for sexual freedom and a reverent recognition by the other. Before the climactic flood, the sexual energy of Yvette's primitive desire takes the form of a search for recognition. Yvette is hostile to her family members who maintain a false morality. The old and blind grandmother with her insatiable greed for life, other people's life, the pious Aunt Sissy, who is gnawed by an inward warmth, and her unbelieving father who recoils when he is faced with the unconventional. Once she is sexually awakened by her encounter with the gypsy, Yvette becomes susceptible to radical change. The flood creates a rare moment when sex and love converge to breed a significant power of sexual love, allowing Lawrence to reward her rebellion against middle-class conventions and argue for the freedom that her encounter with the gypsy represents. Yvette's personal transformation is depicted in a realistic style that challenges the old moral codes. At first sight, Yvette is obsessed with the gypsy's physicality. She reacts to the feeling of his eyes upon her, quote, Yvette quivered suddenly, as if she had seen his big, bold eyes upon her, with the naked insinuation of desire in them. The absolutely naked insinuation of desire made her lie prone and powerless in the bed. End quote. The thought that the gypsy desires her releases her from the confinement of the rectory, and Yvette is conscious of her own transformation after encounter with the gypsy. They would have consummated their desire in the caravan had not the Easter woods intruded. The failure of their consummation causes sex to step aside and to be erased, but its very absence paradoxically renders sex extraordinarily salient and significant in this love relation. When the gypsy asks Yvette to follow him to the caravan, she, quote, followed the silent, secret, overpowering notion of his body in front of her. It cost her nothing. She was gone in his will, end quote. Irresistible to her, he utterly captivates her as she falls under his spell. This significant encounter with the gypsy liberates Yvette and transforms her into a new woman. Eileen Chan adopts another way of subtly indicating sexual love. In Less Caution, she implies that Wang Jiazhi's love for Mr. Yi, a collaborator with the Japanese puppet government in China, originated with a woman's sexuality, her deepest self. Love in Less Caution presents itself as abruptly and mysteriously at the very end, as does the flood at the end of The Virgin and the Gypsy. At the very moment when he is to be assassinated, Mr. Yi buys Jiazhi a pink diamond ring, a symbolic promise of happiness. In the otherworldly jewelry shop, Jiazhi sinks into contemplation and slips into a dreamlike state. This implicitly reveals the sexuality that generates love. Jiazhi in the jewelry shop exemplifies other people's definition of love. Love is connected to power, end quote. The way to a woman's heart is through her vagina, end quote. Even though rejecting this saying as something vulgar, Jiazhi finds herself, quote, unable to refute that notion that she is in love with Mr. Yi entirely, end quote. While she is entirely alone in the store with Mr. Yi and can see his sad but tenderly affectionate contemplation, Jiazhi suddenly realizes that her love for Mr. Yi is true. The ring here symbolizes a desirable, genuine, indestructible, and permanent love for which Jiazhi's private self has been pining during the cruel war, in which all the nationalists were indifferent to private feelings. Quote, he really loves me, she thought. Inside, she felt a raw tremor of shock, then a vague sense of loss. It was too late. Run, she said softly, end quote. She saves her lover at this instant when the feeling of true love shocks and awakens her deepest self. Jiazhi discovers love, recognizes her innermost self, and liberates her female desire from the confinement of Confucian morality and national commitment in this perilous liaison. Jiazhi's transformation is deeply rooted in her sexual love. Her individual search for mutual recognition is through sexual love, regardless of political agenda. Like Yvette, she becomes aware of her body, heart, and self. However, this awareness is delayed. During the period of her sexual experiences with Mr. Yi, she develops feelings for him, even though she remains unaware of them. She only recognizes the love when she's given a rare diamond that represents his commitment to her. Eventually, sexuality converges with love to breed a sexual love that dramatically changes the whole history of the novella. Beneath the symbolic mode of writing in both Chan and Lawrence lies the ambiguity of the relation between love and sex in the stories. For Lawrence, it is certain that Yvette and the gypsy love each other, but sex is highly ambiguous. Even in the final scene of the flood, their sexual consummation has been held in suspense over the course of the narrative. The absence of sex, however, enlarges and strengthens its significance in the final scene in which love can utterly replace sex. It does not matter whether the virgin and the gypsy eventually have sex or not, because love equates to sex at the sleeping and precious moment of encounter. In contrast, Annie Chan explicitly reveals the existence of sex between Jiazhi and Mr. Yi, regardless of the omission of sex scenes. Love is quite evasive and uncertain compared to the open existence of sex in this novella. The only moment in which sex equates to love is when Jiazhi looks at the pink ring that Mr. Yi is buying for her. Observing the gift of love, Jiazhi links love to sex in her stream of consciousness in the jewelry store. She sacrifices herself to save her lover before the imminent assassination. This moment of enlightenment is crucial because the disclosure of sexual love is held in suspension over a long period of time in which Jiazhi was weaponizing sex in order to manipulate Mr. Yi. Such a temporal displacement of sexual love demonstrates the difficulty in reinterpreting the meaning of sex to arrive at love. When Jiazhi is imagining and envisioning true love, sex and love encounter each other and create a fleeting moment of rare utopian love, which is deeply meaningful because this utopian vision results in a change in Jiazhi's understanding of herself and by extension, her political identity. The fulfilling moment of sexual love marks her dramatic participation in politics. With the expectation of utopian love ahead, Jiazhi transforms her understanding of sex in a way that brings sex out of the realm of private experience and transports it into a discursive realm, which is immediately public. In that moment, she realizes that sexual love is defining for the self, which gains autonomy and freedom. The private only becomes public through an act of reinterpretation that is driven by the longing for love and culminates in the establishment of sexual love. Likewise, at the end of Lawrence's novella, love presents itself in a utopian moment. If the flood represents mythical sex, then the letter the gypsy writes to Yvette fulfills a sexual love. The latter establishes mutual recognition and affection by discursively recasting sexual desire as a human bond. At the very last moment, the sexual love reveals itself as something that transcends class and ethnic boundaries, thereby entering into the public discourse also. The imbalanced ratio of sex and love in the structure of these two novellas reveals an alternative understanding of sexual love that is dramatically opposed to a definition of sexual love in which sex and love are naturally integrated and intertwined. Both Lawrence and Chan propose a sexual love in which the linkage between sex and love is extremely delicate and unstable. Therefore, they emphasize the ultimate value of sexual love because it is very rare and ephemeral for sex and love to converge and equate with each other. The precious coincidence of sex and love creates a utopian moment that transforms sex into the sexual love that releases the power of a private feeling so that it engages with public discourse. Now move on to the differences between Lawrence and Chan relating each text to its context. So amplifying the woman's gaze, Lawrence and Chan both focus on female desire. Each story represents a female viewpoint that disturbs and disrupts the masculine discourse about women's bodies and sexuality. Both authors looked for ways to articulate what we see today as a feminist point of view. However, different authorial intentions are found behind the seemingly similar feminist awareness. While both authors approach the topic of sexual love by seeking a utopian aspect in the convergence of sex with love, their differing contexts lead to alternative imaginings of such a utopian moment. Besides the dissimilar conventions that shaped each author, different worldviews inform their distinctive literary narratives about women and individualism. This disparity comes to light in the images of women in their narratives. Jiazhi and Yvette differ a great deal if one delves into the details. Jiazhi has conformed to her social role until her last-minute awakening, while Yvette discovers her sexual self in the beginning and consistently works towards her self-emancipation. Jiazhi's preference for her bodily and emotional self comes at the cost of her life, while Yvette's rebellion is rewarded with the gypsy's act of life-saving. Whether Jiazhi's desire was attained or denied remains perplexingly ambivalent, but it is clear that Yvette is empowered by her newly discovered sexuality and worldliness. In contrast to Yvette's gypsy, Jiazhi's lover terminates her awakened self-knowledge, her promised love for life. Her death ironically perpetuates women's marginalization, bodily effacement, and endless struggle for their own power in a male-dominated society. Eileen Chan's Last Caution is as much a discourse about powerless as it is about power. Chan complicates and problematizes Jiazhi's self-sacrificial love, unveiling the tension between individual desire and state politics. An awakened woman ready to pursue her individual fulfillment is constantly threatened by unreconciled social expectations about women's sex and gender. The ambiguity concerning female desire, achieved or frustrated, problematizes the dichotomy between the private and the public in the revolutionary culture. As a woman, Chan was aware of the powerful suppressions that women encountered and experienced in early 20th century China as a result of Confucianism and patriotism. On the other hand, it was more difficult for Eileen Chan to revolt than for Lawrence, who was born into a working class family. As one of the last aristocrats from the Qing dynasty, brought up in a traditional family but exposed to Western education, Chan could not completely betray traditional moral principles, nor could she embrace the radical patriotic dogma that ended the final empire. This ambivalence explains the irresolution and the vacillation presented by Chan's heroines, including Jiazhi. Eileen Chan's novella ends with the failure of a woman's pursuit of emotional fulfillment. Compared to Eileen Chan's frustrated attempt to liberate women from the demands of nationalism, Lawrence extends his critique directly towards social order rather than merely cultural politics by injecting his heroic, vigorous, and triumphant spirit into his representation of women and sexuality. Lawrence intensely engaged with social political problems. However, the hopelessly fallen world, troubled by war, money-driven industrialism, labor strikes, and obsolete moral conventions, disheartened and frustrated Lawrence. He took a radically utopian leap by retreating into the private sphere where he believed life and regeneration were possible and radical individualism could offer an alternative solution to the problems of the outside world. The seemingly domestic topic of women and sexuality actually embodies Lawrence's ambition to address social political issues. Lawrence believed women's sexuality and communion between man and woman could offer a utopian transcendence of the bleak situation. Indeed, to Lawrence, women and Wong serve as the path to the regeneration of the world. His depiction of rebellious women and liberating sexual relations is a response to the social political tensions and problems in his time. Set against Eileen Chan, Lawrence seems more determined and aggressive in his cultural critique. His heroines are therefore rendered as strong and invincible. Yet, Yvette never submits. The mystical flood charged with the irresistible sexual power destroys the old world and creates a new possibility. Yet his great leap of literary imagination from a dystopian England to an enlightening man-woman sexual love can be a utopian vision for the West, compared to Chan's cold, pessimistic, but realistic depiction of a depressing Chinese society. Eileen Chan experimented in different ways from Lawrence and moved away from social political expectations, thereby indicating her latent resistance to social conventions in both Confucianism and nationalism. Lawrence endeavored to release English literature from sexual suppression by depicting intense relationships driven by sexual desire, stemming from the deepest self. Depicting women as real people with sexuality and love, Lawrence had a great impact on sexual freedom, freedom of the press, and the beginning of the second wave of feminism in the latter part of the 20th century. As a male writer who was concerned about social conventions and politics, Lawrence adopted the subversive power of sexual love to rebel against the prevailing false morality and class hierarchy that defined British nationalism in the early 20th century. As for Eileen Chan, individualism embodied in women's subjectivity, feelings, and sexual love elegantly and covertly eroded the Chinese discourse of nationalism in the first half of the 20th century. This mode of individualism was passed on to numerous modern and contemporary Chinese writers such as Li Yang, Shi Shuqing, Zhong Xiaoyang, and Wang Anyi. All these Chan school writers developed the themes of women and love in conjunction with individualism. So to briefly conclude, a comparison of Lawrence's The Virgin and the Gypsy and Eileen Chan's Last Caution provides a good example of the way in which the analysis of each text depends on the comparison with the other through the third term of a cosmopolitan love. In the case of these two texts, both authors explore the way in which sexual love differs in two cultural historical contexts, but simultaneously can lead to a utopian emancipation, which I call affective cosmopolitanism. So this is the end of the talk, and thank you so much for your time and attention. And I'm welcoming your questions, and I'll be happy to engage with the audience, and including the online audience. And I just want to thank the online audience, especially like those who are also doing Eileen Chan. I've heard that there are like two previous Eileen Chan talk series speakers. So I'll be happy also to address any students' questions. So scholars, colleagues, and friends and students. So you're welcome to give me, throw your questions to me, and I'll try to, address it.
Professor Yao just made my job really easy because she's already moderating the Zoom discussion. I think still have questions. No, that's just a technical thing. So the floor is open. Maybe we can take some questions.
Hi, I was wondering, I was thinking about talking about pool, whether pool can combine facts because these two authors are really novels. And in Rise of the Novel, in Law's book, Rise of the Novel, it mentions how Rise of the Novel is a rise of school, a personal experience, social economic changes. You also mentioned a lot about person and how the novel provides this space for detailed exploration of female inner world and their own subjectivity. So I was wondering whether you would link this exploration of the form of these two novels in their own cultural context to the exploration of cosmopolitanism or female subjectivity.
So thanks for the question. It's a great question. Yes, I do think that the form is very important. And to me, the form is really like the aesthetic structure. And you also mentioned about the role of women or women characters. It's part of the form actually, right? So for us, it's really important to do the close reading, the hermeneutic tradition. That is something that, the close reading of the text is to find out the structure of the text. And that's something that we do as, literature people that is different from those social sociology, anthropology, because I really think that it's more focusing on, the person and individual, and in your case, like, one particular woman, the self. So this is like some kind of like the basic approach, I think, every time doing literary text analysis. The form is always kind of a tool for me to approach the content and also the major theme in there, because the form is actually always integrated with the theme and the topic, which is also something that is very important. So actually, people usually think that the form and then the theme are usually separate, but it's actually always integrated.
Thank you so much.
Sijia, please.
Sijia, thank you so much. It's a very great talk. I look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
So when it comes to, I like the idea of setting these writers, Lawrence and John, both in their own context, and there's relationship, call it relationship, and make the two sets of relationships speak to each other. And I'm familiar with Lawrence's novel. So what year was that? When was the novel first?
Oh, it's you catch me. So it was actually reaching to, yeah, I should have put the year of the novella, but it's reaching to his later writing career.
1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, something like that.
1920s.
Yeah, so it's really kind of like it's kind of like he was actually traveling all over the world, and then he started to writing this actually a story still about England, even though he was like traveling all over South America, and so that was talking about like how he was actually doing like as like a migrant writer. He was actually thinking still about his local culture, even though he was like being a cosmopolitan writer. I do think that being cosmopolitan is not necessarily always talk about the world. It's sometimes it's actually you kind of like being open-minded and be cosmopolitan is actually you go back to kind of ponder upon your own national tradition, culture, and usually it's not like to comply with the convention or the local culture. It was always like they always have this adamant critique attitude, which I appreciate that. And then I always like, thinking that they do have this, both authors are having a tension between themselves and the local culture, the dominant discourse, and there's a tension in there.
That's great. That's great. Can I follow up?
I think
so Lawrence is so that novella was the end of his writing career, so more representative of his late style. So there's a comparison there. That after traveling, long travels with Eileen John's writing of Constitution. Right? So,
Yeah.
So there's that. So there's an extensive history both in the writing of the So my question is that when it comes to Alvin Zhang, there is a former life of less caution that being inspiring that was written in English that was 1992. So following that, there are 2 decades writing and
Yeah,
rewriting and revising and ending with the 1978 publication of Less Caution. Which version of Less Caution was in your framework is an actual dialogue with Lawrence? To set up these relations very deeply, I'm just wondering which moment actually intersect.
Well, it's well, right now I'm using the text one, obviously is the final publication. Yeah, right. Yeah, and then of course she was like writing and rewriting. I'm actually very happy to present this sexual love that is related to Lust Caution, because it was actually a very controversial work by Annie Chan. And I remember you made a comment saying that, I think it's in the book, Women, War, and Domesticity. And then you were saying that this is actually the only Annie Chan's work that is about war politics. So I think there is some kind of interesting connection between the Virgin and Gypsy. I think it's 1926. Yeah. And then Lust Caution, that is, also, yeah, it's like, the Virgin and Gypsy is kind of returned after World War One. It's also like, kind of, the war is actually absent in there, but I'm kind of feel like there's some kind of the World War One shadow in there. He was very disappointed about the civilization, and that's why he went to these primitive culture to find the solution. Actually, in the later year, he actually went to the Eastern philosophy to find solutions and answers. And I think that's kind of like something that is not direct connection with Aini Chan, but there's kind of like he's moving more towards Eastern culture. And then Aini Chan also she was writing also after World War II. So it's kind of like having this kind of a war narrative that is very different from the official narrative of war politics. And it's so interesting to see that I was kind of like really doing this close reading of how sex, this idea of sex is actually linked to, also transforms to this love. Because in the wartime official narrative, usually this kind of sexual love is usually kind of like evasive and like, but in this novella, there's like war and love in there. But people usually say war and love, but actually the 99% is actually about sex in the beginning. And then like this very moment, it just suddenly transformed the sex part into this love, which is so precious and so transformative and totally elevate the aesthetic value of this novella. So yeah, it's very interesting to see that the war narrative connected to both texts in there, and to set up the question, to set up the comparative connection, which is they're both responding to that kind of like a very similar but also disparate cultural context that both local culture were experiencing. So
Follow up.
yes, please.
So when I wrote that, the only story I didn't tell story about war and is it war and love? War and love? What did I write? I completely forgot. But in any case, that was before we saw my head. That was war. That was published.
Oh
before
yeah,
Shao Mai.
yeah,
That was published
right.
before Shao Shai.
Mhm.
So in light of these postmodern the last few years, so I wonder, what is it? I mean, Lawrence, of course, Lawrence was one of the writers impacted by the Johnson.
Actually, I was arguing like, Lawrence was not giving direct influence to Eileen Chen. I was trying to argue it. That's why I would kind of like avoid the traditional comparative mode, which is parallel or influence. I'm trying to say that I'm trying to do another way of comparative methodology.
It's not about a say because she read Lawrence book.
She did. I also mentioned in the book.
Lawrence was informing Lawrence was a chorus of other English writers about Wells, Huxley, Somerset Maugham, Stella Benson, chorus of texts of Lawrence, and Lawrence is one link in it. But I think the sexual love is great. But what about having Lawrence also speak to other works by Annie Johnson? Last Caution is certainly not alone, than Shao Shuai. There's so much of it is about sex, so much of it is about love, and also Shao Shuai. It's much of that.
Right. Xiao Tang actually is in my chapter 4. I chose it. Yeah, there's some kind of sexual love. I'm glad you mentioned about it in the little reunion. But actually, I kind of like identify more of the transcendental love. Yeah. It's also, Last Caution is actually more fictional than the little reunion. It's more like autobiographical. And then the Virgin Gypsy is also fictional instead of autobiographical. Actually, for Lawrence, Women in Love is more autobiographical. We can see that him and Frida. So yeah, that's why I kind of draw the connection. But the reason I draw them is actually always under this purposiveness is like I find connection, but at the same time I see their responses actually kind of making a conversation, but at the same time so drastically different. And I also kind of like, talk the differences a lot because I really think differences also very matter. But to me, the connection is also so important because we need to set up this basis of, I don't want to use the commonality, but I want to use this disparate connection so that to de-binarize the two entities.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Yeah, so
Thanks so much for your multiple questions and help me to to think through. Alvin.
I was reading your introduction of the book and definitely read more beyond the introduction, but I was really intrigued by also what you mentioned today, third term comparison, because I can see how your work is expanding on the very debate on comparison and conflict and questions of translatability. And I see that you sort of draw on Han Sasi's work, Xu Meishu's work. Yeah, Shishume's work, others.
David
But
Gordon.
translation
I didn't quote him, but it was there.
So translation as comparison, and comparison as relation. But I was also thinking how you might be revising, or maybe you're having a dialogue with Franco Marcus. Of course, that whole essay and whole book, approaching world literature from you don't get more from reading more. That's sort of his argument, and foreign universal plots and local variations. And after that, there are so many debates about methodology. And I think your approach is really doing a revitalized version of close reading, that you do gain more from doing comparison that is purposive, that is focusing on concept of love, force, and sexuality, and across and revitalizing the methods of East-West. Right? And I also see how your work might be in conversation with Clara Iwasaki, so her book about rethinking modern Chinese literary canons, and she also she gave a talk for us too, and sort of looking at the feminist messages and xiaotongs and ethics work. And Eileen Chan, yeah, she sort of brings a lot of people in. And so I was just wondering how you see your work in dialogue with trans-Pacific and Sinophone approaches to the questions of comparison.
So that's a great question. Yeah. I would say that I feel like, in the Chinese studies, we all know Eileen Chan. But beyond that, beyond the Chinese studies, if you tell people like Eileen Chan, even some professors, right, they don't know, even though they're doing literature. So I just feel like, this is like some kind of really need to rethink about the canon, the Chinese studies canon. And we need to bring more people like, Eileen Chan and, like different people from different, kind of critiquing and also depicting China in different period of time. So yes, and also I feel like, this Eileen Chan is actually included into the world literature canon, right? Based on, contributions by like David Danrosh, like Norton, and the mainstream canonical anthology, they including it. But I really also sometimes I kind of doubt if people really understand Eileen Chan so much, even though they are reading just like maybe a sealed off story as a must read. But they're like such a huge, just an ocean of world literature actually. And then go back to this Franco Moratti. I'm glad you bring him up. I do have this kind of a conversation, kind of like with these previous scholars. I'm really grateful for all their contributions to the world literature and comparative literature. I was kind of like based on their insights and work. But at the same time, this is like our work is to not just appreciation, but also critiquing, right? So critiquing, kind of like like world literature. Some of the gender, like doing more translation to introduce Chinese literature and to include more Chinese literary works like Eileen Chan into the canon is a great work. We need to do it more. But at the same time, because life is so short, students' lives are so, rich, right? How can we read an ocean of world literature, like within, say, 4 years as an BA or, PhD, 5 years, 6 years? It's impossible. It's mission impossible. So Franco Moratti is talking about like distant reading and kind of having this kind of combined with machine and calculation and then using a machine to do the reading instead of human doing reading. But I'm kind of like feel like we need a balance to have also like every reader need to pick up this close reading skill and then really to engage the text and really take patience to read the work and then to not just reading and for fun, but also giving some kind of like personal critique to engage and at the same time like also at the same time reading is creation. So for them is like not just like shouldn't be passive reading but active reading. So yeah, the world literature is actually kind of like gaining momentum. But I would say that we need to maybe pause a little and then to kind of think about what about the tradition of comparative literature. We still need to do comparison. If we just translation everything into English, that's kind of like creating another hegemony of English. So ethically, I kind of feel like we still need to learn at least another language to really master this language and be able to understand the text better than just reading the English translation. So that we can compare. Because to compare is not just for the sake of comparison. To compare is a way to live, to think, and also to exist. We actually do comparison all the time, even though we're not a PhD student in comparative literature, we do always comparison. And the comparison is really something that we realize that, doing comparison makes me know the other, but also know myself and the world better. Yeah, this is a great question. So thanks for the chance for me to elaborate the part that maybe like it's this is like a talk like very encrypted. It's like lots of like compressed and lots of ideas. So by rebellion, so in the sexual in Last Caution, and did you also mention about H. Lawrence's The Virgin and Gypsy, or just only the Last Caution? Mhm. So by rebellion, they actually, I would say it's kind of like, as I said, it's like a stance of critique. So they are critiquing their local culture. So the England and also the Chinese local culture in that time. Um, that's why I was giving the example of, the comparison between Jane Austen and Lin Shuhua, because you can still do the comparison between these two women writers. They're great. I like them. But if you're putting these two together, what you get is just very plain comparison because both of them are actually comply with the local conventions. They didn't actually critique with the local conventions. So if you just do comparison of these two, it's actually, you already know the result. Actually, you don't need to do the literature work by these two. You can just, being a sociologist or anthropologist or historian, go directly to the facts and the historical records. You don't have to do the literature because what they do is like, you are just reading their text and actually you're just reading directly the society. There's no personal responses, there's no private thinking. So that's what I say, like literary criticism is interesting because you see very unique, usually author, right? And nowadays filmmakers, their personal responses to the society, even though they claim that they are apolitical, actually paradoxically they're not. That's why I'm saying that the Last Caution is actually very political. It's about politics actually. Why she is betraying her task, that's a rebellion, right? Why does she betray this task? It's a nationalist, is very important to nationalist cause, is because she realized that her primal self, and to kind of like, this private love is a kind of a driver for her to engage with the world. And then in the process of engaging, she is actually revising her attitude and the way she engages with the world. She totally becomes an opposing person, like a person that is totally opposite to the previous her. And that's really enlightening and also transforming. So as a person, I think it's a very rich experience, but also as a literary work, I think it's not just about personal experience or transformation, it's about the author's responses to the society. It's rebellion, but I mean, rebellion probably is a strong word. It could be like to the extreme, it could be rebellion, but the basic is always being critique, but not like, critique for the sake of critique. Like some people are like, oh, I want to be cool and I want to critique, I want to rebel. Not like that. It's just like a very natural process after responding and kind of reflecting about your life experience in the novel, and then you make a decision that is kind of like very decisive, totally change the history of that novella narrative. I don't want to use subversive because it's only one kind of form to be critiquing. Because sometimes you kind of critique, but not necessarily rebellious and subversive in that kind of radical extreme way. Eileen Chan was kind of like critiquing in a more insinuating way. So what's your question? I think I kind of like interrupted a little.
I'm very interested in this for the notion of cosmopolitanism. I think there's so many layers in the cosmopolitanism. I'm just interested in its action.
Yeah, you're right. This idea of cosmopolitan love is multiple layered. And the best way is to get my book and read it. And yeah, so the book is divided into 4 chapters, and I was just giving the sexual love, and what you get is defiance, which is very good. It's like very the sexual love is really always like rendered by some kind of impulse in there. And then the first chapter was about incestual love, which is actually I'm using this incest prohibition from anthropology theory to critique, the Heart Sutra Xinjing, and Lawrence's canonical work, Sons and Lovers. And then that part is like how to critique your local culture. How do you become a cosmopolitan? By first critiquing your local culture. And then the third part is about adulterous love. And then the last part is I already mentioned, is transcendental love. So it is kind of like using 4 cases to kind of like, explain what is that cosmopolitan love. So my starting point is I also introduce, Appiah's theory. But actually, Appiah, when he's talking about cosmopolitanism, I'm not using his major idea. I was actually taking a very minor thought he had, and then I was developing that part. He's like the main thing is like he was talking this the love for stranger, and this love for stranger is so important. It was actually in part of the essential cosmopolitan love. It's like kind of like very important in there, the idea.
I just want to say that this is a book talk,
isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, no, I look forward to reading the book. I take your point.
It's just so condensed.
Yeah, no, I understand now. I mean, despite that, world literature has become the mainstream, it seems to have been replaced comparative literature. You're arguing that there's still value in comparative literature, what we do.
Yeah, because Viva said comparative literature is dead, right? The death of comparative literature.
You say it's not dead, as long as we are aware of, just be very wary of the binaries that somehow dictated comparative literature in its olden days, right? And then also be very mindful of all the pitfalls associated with the act of comparison that we still continue. I mean, we cannot not. I get your point.
Yeah, I'm just trying to renovate this comparative literature. The original idea. I do think there's a value, and it's not like I'm just living in ivory tower and just doing my research. The reason, my purpose to write this book is because I see it is so close to the current issues that we're so chauvinistic, we're so isolated from each other. We don't trust each other. We don't want to talk. There's no love for strangers. So that's the purposiveness behind this cosmopolitan, which is one of the layers, like again, so many layers. So yeah, I do think that we need to read as much as we can, and world literature is doing it for us. It's facilitating us to read a lot. But at the same time, we still need to go back to the original point of the comparative literature to think about how we can use this methodology to make the world better. How to live a better life, like a very basic thing. So yeah, that's hopefully it's also a contribution to.
It's also a contribution that you're helping Eileen Zhang, reading of Eileen Zhang to enter more into mainstream of the Anglo-American context, right?
Yes,
So
we're doing the
it's-
same thing.
You're doing the same thing. I'm doing something quite different, but I definitely see Sijia Lawrence is a bridge, almost like a bridge figure, somehow to somehow break away from these national boundaries that China versus West, somehow helping Eileen Zhang to be read, to be seen outside of the Chinese.
Thank you.